This has been fantastic. I was sitting in the back of the room and I said to Doc, I hope I'm shaped up because from where I was sitting, I have never been in a room with so many beautiful haircuts. All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about communicating about health. I must admit this is one of the hardest presentations I've ever had to write because I'm talking to you about something that you're already an expert in. And so rather than like going on this long tirade about communication, I really just want to speak 3,000 foot and give you some of the strategy that we're working with so that you have a bigger picture of what we're doing and how you fit in within that from a communication standpoint. And then I want to talk a little bit specifically about talking about health and some of the stickier, tougher conversations that we have to have. Okay, from a 3,000 foot perspective, I want to offer you a framework for thinking about how we think about communication and the elements of communication. And I offer you this background to give you some knowledge of the various moving parts, because as you're going through these conversations, you're going to want to adjust to this situation, to the person, to the conversation, and having this sort of bigger picture can help you think about the different elements that are going on in a communication interaction. So when we think about communication, interpersonal, face-to-face communication, I think about the elements of that interaction in terms of 5 things. There's a source, there's a message, there's a channel, there's a receiver, and there's an effect. In other words, someone says something to someone else through a particular channel, and that thing that they've said has an effect. Who says what to whom, through what channel, and with what effect. So as health ambassadors, you are going to be in a bunch of different situations, but you're going to be practicing strategic communication, right? You're not just shooting the breeze with people. There's a point to the conversation that you're trying to have. And so when you're trying to have a very strategic conversation, it's good to keep in mind these different elements that you may need to adjust according to the circumstances. The source. Fortunately, I don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide because you have this piece on lock. The source is all about credibility. A source that has credibility is most likely to be effective, and you have this, right? Your clients trust you. They identify with you. They find you to be generally sincere. They trust your consult. They come to you for advice. Attractiveness isn't just about how handsome or attractive you are, although you are in a room with very attractive people. It's also about your positionality in the community, right? Attractiveness is about aspirations. People admire who you are in the community. And so for these reasons, you have a high level of credibility. You also have authority. You have experience. You have credentials. You now have this training, so now you have health-related credentials if you didn't have those before, but you've also got credentials in your space. You all have reputations that you bring to the table, which makes you ideal deliverers of these messages. And sources are more likely to be effective when they resonate with people, when people can identify with you. And in order to resonate with somebody, what you're saying has to be relevant to them in this particular situation. So that's an important point because often these conversations can seem to come out of left field, but sometimes how you can start the conversation is by making whatever you're talking about relevant to the conversation about HIV and HIV stigma. And I'm going to give you some strategies in just a little bit to think through how you can do that. Another element of the communication situation is the message itself, like what you say, how you say it. Because it's not just, my husband says this all the time, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, right? We frame things. When we tell a story, you're necessarily leaving some information in the story and you're leaving some information out of the story. Sometimes you do that on purpose, sometimes it's just part of how you tell the story. But when you're talking to someone about something, you're framing the story, or you're framing what you're talking about necessarily. Some information gets left in, some information gets left out. But what's important about that is the way that we tell a story or the way that we talk about something really shapes how people understand that thing. If you tell it one way, it invites a totally different kind of understanding than if you choose to tell it another way. As a result, frames really define what's happening. They give us boundaries around the problem. They tell us what the cause of the problem is, and if certain causes invite certain kinds of solutions. And so frames tell us what the problem is, what the boundaries are, who should solve it, how it should be solved. It creates a sense of us and a sense of them. It gives us reasons to support, reasons to oppose. So an example of that is conversations around abortion. So pro-life invites you to think about this phenomenon in a particular kind of way. When I say pro-life, that sets up the problem as a life and death problem. But if I say pro-choice, that sets up the problem as a problem of freedoms, right? So here, we're creating teams. One team is arguing for life, pro-life, and one team is arguing for choice, pro-choice. And somehow these two teams are pitted against each other. Necessarily, those frames are leaving certain things out. It is possible to be both pro-life and pro-choice. But by setting up the frames the way that they're set up, they invite you to think about certain things and not think about other things. So when someone says pro-life, you think about life and death. When someone says pro-choice, you think about your liberties. You think about your rights. You think about your personal choices and your ability to make those choices. So this is just an example of the ways that the language that we use sets up the phenomenon in a certain kind of way so people understand it in a certain kind of way. That's going to come back in just a minute too. And then we send messages through channels. When someone's sitting in your chair, you are talking with them face to face. The channel is face-to-face communication. And different channels have different affordances. Different channels let you do different kinds of things. Like the kinds of messages that you can send over social media are very different than the kinds of messages that you can put on a billboard, right? Because social media is interactive, you can get feedback, you can have audio visual, so you can use sound to work in your favor. Whereas a billboard, you gotta get what you have to say in like 3 or 4 words that someone can grasp and understand as they drive by. So different channels give you the ability to do different things. And in the grand scheme of this project, there are multiple channels that are being activated at the same time. And that's important because of synergy. You are the most important channel. And the project is trying to amplify what you're doing by having billboards, by having social media. And so to the extent that all of these things are operating at the same time and people are getting the same message through different channels, then what you're trying to do is more likely to be effective. But you are the most important channel here. The other channels are supporting you, right? You're delivering the message, you're changing the message according to the situation, you're responding to people, you're appealing to people based on what you know about them. And then these social media, the broadcast media, the ads and so on, those are designed to bolster what you're saying. Those are designed to create synergy. And to the extent that these things are all sending the same message through different channels, it's more likely to be effective. All right. The other moving part in this calculation is the receiver. And Dr. Kerr just talked about stigma, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that point, but it's really important here because people are not a blank slate. People don't come to you like just ready to receive everything you're trying to tell them, right? People come with worldviews. They come with attitudes. They come with predispositions. They come with stigmas and biases. And we also have those things. So most of the time, you don't want to just dive right into the conversation and just start talking about what it is that you want to talk about. You want to spend some time listening so that you can understand their point of view, understand their perspective, so that you can craft a message that resonates with that person, given what you know about them, and given how you understand where they're at. The thing about biases like prejudice and stigma is that they can make these conversations really, really hard to start. And they can also make the conversations really, really hard to continue. So biases like prejudice and stigma mean that people have already made their minds up before they sit in your chair based on some little tiny piece of information, right? And then they're projecting that piece of information. We have stigmas about and stereotypes about people who are living with HIV, people who are injecting drugs, people who have multiple sex partners. We have a whole bunch of stigmas that we attach to these different groups of people. The thing about stigmas is that they can be either implicit or explicit, meaning somebody could say to you something that tells you that this person is biased in this way, or they could just be thinking it and you don't even know it's on their mind. And so they're really hard to detect, stigmas and biases. Also because they're more likely to be implicit, meaning people aren't voicing their stigmas and biases and telling you, hey, I don't want to associate with anybody who blah, 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 right? They're not going to always say that out loud because it's not always an acceptable thing to say. But you can detect those stigmas and biases if you're really listening closely to what people are telling you. And one of the ways to deal with stigmas and biases is to address them, to anticipate them and address them. And I'm not saying that you tell somebody, oh, you're biased in these ways. What I'm saying is you hear the things that people are saying, you understand that this person's point of view is biased, and you factor that in when you're talking to them. And you build the message that you're sending to them knowing that this is how they feel. And so you can be explicit about the stigmas and biases that people have. You can get in front of it, in other words. But it's not going to be very fruitful if you start finger pointing at people. You know that. You can't just be like, you're a homophobe, and you're a homophobe, and that's not going to be very effective, right? I find in my work that one way to deal with stigmas and biases and get people to reflect on them is to back off by one level of abstraction. So instead of talking about you, I might talk about some people. Some people think, some people say, I knew this guy one time, he said this, that cat said that, this lady, back it off by a level of abstraction so people don't feel like you're attacking them. Because if we're saying you, we're finger pointing and people start to get defensive and then they're not listening to you anymore. Which brings me to my next point, counter-arguing. Counter-arguing is your competition. People are counter-arguing with you. In their heads, they may not be doing it out loud, it could be explicit or it could be implicit. So when you're talking about the things that you're talking about, it behooves you to try to anticipate what people's counter-arguments are. Do you know what I mean when I'm saying counter-arguments? They're arguing with you. And it's even worse if they don't say it out loud because then you don't know what's happening and you're talking and you're doing your very best and they're in their heads arguing with you and you don't even realize. So one of the ways that we can effectively communicate and strategically communicate is to try to anticipate the things that people are going to be saying. For example, when I try to talk to people about HIV, one of the most common things somebody says to me is, well, I'm not that active. I don't have to worry about it. I'm not that active. Meaning, I don't have sex with a lot of people, or I don't have a lot of sex, or I'm not in the street. So if I'm talking to someone, I know that's going to come up. Even if they're not saying it out loud, I know it's going to come up. So when I talk to people about HIV, I preempt that counter-argument. I start out by saying, you don't actually have to have a whole lot of sex for HIV transmission to happen. You don't have to have a lot of partners. You just have to have one instance of blood-to-blood contact. Oh, well, I'm not a hoe, but HIV is not about who you are. It's about what you do and what your sex partners do. And your sex partners don't live in your pocket. So you can anticipate what they're going to think and then get in front of it and get rid of those counter-arguments before they even come up. This is something that you can, with practice and with conversations, you can start to see patterns in the way that people are talking to you about this. And so my recommendation is that you try to, as you move forward in these conversations, start anticipating, pay attention to the things that people say, the patterns in the things that people say, and try to build that into your conversation so that you can preempt those counter-arguments. You can correct information as a way to correct these counter-arguments. A lot of the things that people are going to say to you by way of counter-argument is incorrect. A lot of people have misinformation about HIV, and it's very, very important in terms of like the work that we're doing here in terms of ending the epidemic, in terms of ending stigma, until we have correct information, we're not going to be able to do what we came to do, right? So I think it's really important to anticipate the misinformation that people have and correct that. And don't be shy about correcting that. You are the expert, you have credibility, you have expertise, you have authority, and you have resonance. So you know how to correct people without belittling them when they're in your chair. We want to provide new facts as a way to get around those counter arguments. So, oh, but I heard HIV is going down. Why do we have to worry about it? Well, it is going down, but as you saw earlier, it's not going down far enough, and it's certainly not going down far enough in Black communities, because even though it's going down, we are still affected more greatly than other communities. And so those are the kinds of things that you can do to anticipate counter-arguments or address counter-arguments when they come up. You can also challenge the relevance. Sometimes people will be like, well, I'm not in the street. Okay, I'm really glad for you, but that's not what we're talking about here today. What we're talking about is HIV, and being in the street is one way that you can find yourself exposed to HIV, but there are all kinds of other ways. So I'm glad for you that you're not in the street, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is protecting ourselves from all the various ways that HIV can be transmitted. You can provide counterexamples. I just don't recommend naming any names.
No.
Were you? Okay. And you can challenge the source. And this increasingly is like the main way to deal with misinformation, because most of the time when people give you misinformation, it came from some wild source that you're like, would you have them represent you in a court of law? You don't trust that person. Why are you listening to them when it's a matter of your serious health issues, right? So there are a bunch of different ways that you can try to anticipate and deal with counter-arguments without belittling people and without making people feel like they need to defend themselves. The other element is the effect of the communication that we have. Effects can be intended and they can be unintended. The kinds of effects that we want to have, we want to change people's attitudes. We want to change people's ideas of what is and is not acceptable to say. We want to change people's ideas about what other people in the community think. That's how we're getting rid of stigma, right? We're trying to reshape norms around talking about HIV. An intended effect can be that you're raising awareness. This is very specifically what you're trying to do, and you're trying to get people to change their behavior. In the long term, we're riding for policy support and mobilization of the community, but these are more downstream kinds of effects. But what I really want you to take from this slide is that sometimes communication backfires. Sometimes we have unintended effects. So it's not a great situation when you're a strategic communicator and it doesn't land. That just doesn't work. That's not great, but it's also not terrible. It's terrible when it backfires. When you say something and it makes that person dig their heels in on their standpoint, or it makes them become more committed to their point of view. That's what we want to try to avoid. So when we're communicating about health, things can be a little bit tricky because talking about HIV in our communities is not without stigma. And HIV has a lot of baggage. So much stigma. It's hard to talk about HIV. It's hard to talk about HIV transmission. Like in the big sense, we can talk about it all day. We can talk about what HIV has done to our communities. We can talk about how it was mishandled when it first came out and how that has affected us over these years. But when you try to, and people are perfectly willing to have that conversation. But when we start trying to talk about HIV risk and our own specific situations, people get real defensive real fast. And so that makes it really tricky to try to have these conversations, especially kind of in a semi-public space when there are other people can hear and so on. So a couple of strategies to try to grease the wheels of that conversation. When we're communicating about health, I want you to remember three things. Active listening, purposefully listening to the other person, like being in it with them. paying attention and showing that you're paying attention. That's two different things, right? It's one thing to be paying attention, but if the person you're talking to feels that you're not listening to them, you're gonna lose them. So I wanna talk a little bit in a second about how to actively listen, how to establish resonance or a connection with the person that you're talking with, and then thinking about strategic messaging, that is purposeful communication that wants to accomplish a goal, specifically reducing stigma around talking about HIV and AIDS transmission in our communities. Paying attention. Okay, everybody stand up. Thank you. Okay, have a seat. All right, so now we're paying attention. Yeah? Paying attention. Commit to the conversation. Be in the conversation. Be a part of the conversation, right? Reflect on what the person is saying. I can see our eyes glazing over. I know I'm after lunch.
I'm with you.
So, actively listening means saying to yourself, I'm here, I'm doing this right now. And this is going to be probably, I don't have your job, but y'all are paying attention to a lot of things when someone's sitting in your chair. And so paying attention to what they're saying and what you're saying and also what you're doing is a lot to juggle. So, active listening is probably 80% of good communication. Because in order to have a good conversation with someone, you really need to understand where they're at. You really need to understand their point of view so that you can then craft a message that resonates with that point of view. But that starts with active listening. Reflecting on what they're saying, being in it with them, being curious about their point of view. And if your mind wanders, inviting yourself back into the conversation. I really want you to pay attention to how you do that, though, because we tend to talk to ourselves in ways that we would never allow other people to talk to us in our own heads. So I invite you to be kind to yourself when you invite yourself back into that conversation. When your mind starts wandering, don't chastise yourself. Just, all right, self, get back in it, and get back in there. But it's a mindful activity. That's what I'm trying to say. Listening is a very active activity. You have to try to listen. Okay. It's not enough to just listen though. You have to appear to be listening as well. If people are going to have these very private, confidential conversations with you. When we're in a conversation, we're giving off cues. Non-verbal cues and verbal cues. The things we do and the things we say. So you can tell someone you're listening to them without saying a word. You can say it with your body language, which is why I asked you to stand up, right? Because I can read the room. I can read body language. Your facial expressions, right? Your eye gaze. I do this when my husband's talking. He just goes and goes. And so the way I tell him I'm done with this conversation, I'm like, and then I don't have to say, for real, we're 5 minutes in. Gestures. Like you can tell somebody, come on, sis, speed it up. Come on. Keep it going. You can, that means something, right? That means something, right? That means something. And all of that is telling the person who's in your chair that you're paying attention to what they're saying, you're reacting with your nonverbals. You can also react with your verbal cues. The things I call nudges, there's a couple different names for these, but yup, no. Right? Like you can nudge people. If they're telling you a story, Those are all nudges. I'm listening to you. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing, but I'm giving you feedback that's telling you that I'm listening to you. You can ask questions that help move the conversation forward in a non-threatening way. I'm going to spend a few minutes on asking questions because I think it's really important in just a second. And then you can echo or summarize what, so what you're saying is, or wait, let me get this right. So you're summarizing what somebody's just told you, which is an indication that I'm listening to you, I've heard what you've just said, and I'm absorbing it. All of these are different ways that you can communicate with someone that you're listening to them. That's before you've even generated a strategic message to get your point across. You're just listening at this point. There are a bunch of different verbal cues. I don't need to go through all of these with you because you have them in your binders. But the acknowledging, these are the nudges. You can synthesize. So it sounds like what you're saying is, and then you sort of put together all the things that they've just told you. Probing. Well, what do you think would happen if you told her X, Y, and Z? I think we all know what would happen if you told her. But you can ask these questions, right, to indicate, these are all just indicating that you're listening. Exactly. I just set the assignment. Yes. Okay. So you can also indicate that you're paying attention by asking questions. And there's a few different kinds of questions that you can ask. There are direct questions that are my favorite because I'm not really good at being subtle. So I just lean all the way into it and just say the thing that's on my mind. And sometimes that's a really good strategy, and sometimes it gets me in trouble. You can ask leading questions. These are questions that invite a certain kind of response. Like, HIV is bad, ain't it? Who's gonna say HIV is good? Nobody's gonna be like, no, I disagree. It's a leading question. You want a certain kind of response, and you craft the question so that you get the response that you want. You can ask steering questions. If the conversation goes off track and you want to bring it back, you can steer the conversation. And sometimes it's like, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I think that that's like, and then you steer the conversation back where you want it to go. I get it and everything, but, and then you bring it back. There are obtuse questions. Obtuse just means like, this is removed from you, right? This is when you feel like people are getting defensive and you don't want to put them on the spot. So you might back it off by a level of abstraction. What do you think other people think? Why do you think that some people are not willing to talk about HIV? Not why are you not willing to talk about HIV? Because you, when someone's getting defensive, you feels like this. Using the word you feels like you're going like this. People don't like it. So you can back it off by a level. Why do you think people think that? We had a whole stigma campaign that was built around that idea, and it's a really effective way to get people to think about their own thoughts and behaviors, is to ask them what other people think. Because they don't know what other people think. They're telling you what they think and masking it under the guise of other people and their point of view. Okay. I encourage you to ask open-ended questions. This is how you get people talking. Open-ended questions are questions that you cannot answer with a yes or a no. You have to, if you're going to respond to an open-ended question, you have to elaborate on what you're trying to say. These are really good for getting people to talk about things. So if you want to get people to elaborate or explain to you something, tell me more, I don't understand. Or, what do you mean by that? That's a good one. What do you mean by that? Because people almost never tell you what they mean when they tell you what they're saying. In other words, you got to get under the hood. Sometimes people will tell you something that gives you a clue about what they really think, and then once you start digging under that thing that they've said, tell me more about, then you get to their actual opinion. So these kinds of questions are really good to get people elaborating on their point of view. This is really good for active listening portions of the conversation. You want to make sure that you give people the opportunity to give you their full point of view. And so you can ask questions like that invite them to finish their thoughts. What am I missing? What do you think about X, Y, or Z? And then there are times when you know somebody's disagreeing with you in their head, but they're not saying it out loud, and you want to encourage them to tell you what's really on their mind. And these are divergence kinds of probes, like, it's cool, speak your mind. You know, this safe space, what's on your mind? Not everybody agrees. What do you think? Those are the kinds of questions that invite people to voice divergent opinions. And you want to be non-judgmental. Let people talk. And you probably aren't going to agree with everything people say, but you do want to fully understand their point of view. So let people talk. It's okay to have a few moments of awkward silence. And then when you talk, incorporate their point of view into what you're saying. It's really important to work to be non-judgmental even though we're not. We're judging most of the time, even when we don't mean to. We're judging. We disagree. We don't like something somebody said. We have thoughts. What matters is that we're paying attention to those judgments and we're not letting them find their way into the conversation, right? Not overtly reacting to the judgments that we're having and trying to check ourselves, like regularly. Okay. The other thing about resonating is that in communication situations, people adapt to the conversation. People adapt to the other person. And that's fruitful. That's really a productive thing to do, is to adapt your messaging to what you know about people. But there are limits to that. So I live in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, there's this word. Can you say it, please? Because I can't.
John.
John.
Wait, you got a Philly cat in here. Hold on. Say it like you say it at home.
Bird game. John.
This is John.
Yep. I can't say it because I'm not from Philly. I don't say it right. And everybody can hear that I don't say it right. So you heard how he said it. Now, if I said it, I would say John. That's not right. I know that's not right. That John was messed up, right? John is anything, everything, all the things. It's a noun. It's an adjective. It's a verb. That John is hot. That John is lit. That John is fast. And that is a Philly John. Right? So this is a word that is a Philly word. And if I was from Philly, and one day I will be, but I would use that word in my conversations. But because I'm not from Philly, if I use that word in my conversations, the person who's on the other end of that conversation is going to flag me as a fake, like that.
False flag.
And that is called over-accommodation. Y'all know John Morgan. I seen a billboard of this cat when I got off the plane. I'm John Morgan. How dare he? This is, first of all, John is a black word. I'm just gonna say.
For real?
John Morgan's not from Philadelphia. I don't know where he's from, but he's not a Philly cat. This didn't work very well for him. So this billboard was up the street from my house, and everyone I knew, no matter who I was in the car with, we drive past that billboard, they'd be. It didn't just fail, it backfired. This is a Philly cat. And he was like, real Philly lawyer, not real Philly lawyer. And so this became a marketing campaign. That is like one of the worst things that can happen if you're a marketer. Someone takes your own campaign and uses it against you. Somebody's going to be asking, John's going to want his money back. Fortunately, you don't have this problem because you have credibility. You have resonance. You are from and with the communities that you're serving. So this isn't something that you need to spend a whole ton of time thinking about, but it is something that you should be aware of. Be mindful of accommodation. And it's important to accommodate to some extent, but there are limits to that. And so the final sort of messaging piece that I want to talk about is I want to offer you some advice about getting into the conversation and then once you're in the conversation, how to carry it. So my recommendations to you, it's really hard for me to tell you how to get into this conversation because you're all very different. You have different personalities. Your clients have different personalities. You have different relationships with different clients. And so you are the best judge of how to enter that conversation. And one way to do that is to develop like 2 to 3 sentences, 2 or 3 different versions of sentences that you can use to enter the conversation that fit who you are. You can tell them something that invites a question, that gets the conversation going. You've just learned a lot of crazy statistics in here today. One way to start that conversation, how was your weekend? Yo, I went to this training. You're not gonna believe the numbers I heard this weekend. Let me tell you what I heard. It could be that direct. But I do want to highlight this point. It is critically important, I believe, that you let people know that you're talking to everyone about this. If you don't do that, people feel like you have singled them out because of something that you think about them, and we just talked about stigma and all the stigmas that are attached to HIV. So then you're gonna lose them because they're gonna think that you're judging them. So I think a really important, if you take nothing else home today, from this conversation, please take this with you. Tell people that you're talking to people about it so they don't feel singled out. And then keep it simple. Use plain language, avoid jargon, and be concise. What do you want people to know? Think about that for yourselves before you go into those conversations. What do you want people to leave the conversation with so that you can keep yourself on the rails during the conversation? I think it's really important to correct misinformation because there's so much of it out there, and you have expertise and you have credibility, so you are uniquely positioned to correct this misinformation and have people believe you. And so I would argue that you should be correcting misinformation and discussing opinions. Opinions, there's no right or wrong. You can agree or disagree, but correcting someone's opinion is a quick way to shut down the conversation. So I invite you to correct misinformation, but discuss opinions. And earlier we talked about framing. How we say things really, really matters. We use a lot of stigmatizing language when we talk about HIV. And these are the ways we talk about things shapes the ways that people understand things. So when we talk about HIV-infected women, that's stigmatizing. That puts HIV in front of the woman. She is a woman who's living with HIV. She's a woman first. She's a whole person who's living with HIV. HIV infections. Infections is the word that's problematic here because it comes with all kinds of baggage. So one way that we can start to brush aside some of that baggage is to talk about transmissions. Use a more safer word. Yes, thank you. HIV infected? Who wants to be called HIV? I'm not. That's not how we talk about people. This is a person who's living with HIV. And so there are a bunch of different ways that we can, just through the choice of words that we use, start to undermine some of that stigma. In the interest of time, I don't have time to do the handouts, but I have included handouts for you to help you think through translating some of this stigmatizing language. There are 3 or 4 sentences that I've offered that I invite you to try and translate for yourselves. How would you say this in a way that is non-stigmatizing? Oh, I can't go without this one. These 2 right here are probably the most common stigmatizing words I hear in my conversations. Well, I'm not promiscuous. Define that. Is it 2 sex partners at the same time? 3? 2 sex partners within 6 months? What does that even mean? Promiscuous is laden with judgment. So we talk about multiple sex partners, not promiscuity. And if you have HIV, then you have HIV. That has nothing to do with whether you clean or dirty. If you bathe, you clean. If you don't bathe, you dirty. That is unrelated to HIV status, right? So being mindful of the words that we're using to talk about HIV so that we don't reaffirm those stigmas. Okay, wait. Yeah. So, in summary, my recommendations to you are to actively listen, resonate with your audience, and be strategic about your messaging. Paying attention using nonverbal and verbal cues is the way to actively listen, and spend more time listening than speaking, at least in the beginning of the conversation. Resonate with folks. At least appear to be non-judgmental. Relate with empathy and curiosity, and that will come about if you're doing that well. If you're actively listening, then you're going to be at least relating with curiosity, at best relating with empathy. And then be genuine. Just do you. Like, you're here because of who you are, because you are perfectly suited for this. You don't have to do a whole lot of bending and twisting to be someone who resonates with the people in your chair. You know this, I don't have to tell you. And then when it comes to the messaging, remember, this is a strategic conversation. You want to get a specific point across, and keep that point in your mind as you're maneuvering through the conversation. Using person-centered and non-judgmental language is going to be critical to doing that well, and correcting information using concrete and specific facts. Like real facts, not fake facts. And you have real facts in your binders that you can use. And some tips for doing this. I feel like I've done this to death, that's enough, I don't need to rehash it. Okay, but there is a notebook, there is another worksheet in your notebook, which I don't have time to cover today. And this is about responding to stigmatizing language and misinformation. So I've crafted a few sentences that are just laden with stigma and misinformation. And I invite you to think about what would you say to that person to correct that misinformation in a way that is non-judgmental and that does not use stigmatizing language. And I am done here, and I have 1 minute left.
Oh, look
So I
at
feel like I accomplished my
Okay.
goal. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for your work.